Welcome to Chronos Talks. This is a podcast by Chronos Sustainability, where we explore in detail some issues of the day and express some of our candid thoughts on what may or may not need to change if we're going to get the world of sustainable finance and corporate sustainability to drive positive real-world impacts. I'm Ash Eyers, research analyst at Chronos, and today I'm joined by Chronos founder, Dr. Rory Sullivan.
Hi Ash, it's great to be here.
Today we're going to talk about stewardship, and in particular the Stewardship Code in the UK, which is currently under review. Now, stewardship, it is about investors having influence on the companies they invest in. Rory, would you agree with that?
Yes, I think that's a good start, Ash. But formally, stewardship can be defined as the way in which investors use their formal rights and their informal influence to shape and direct the way in which companies operate. Those formal rights include the classic voting of shareholdings and the ability to call an AGM. The informal rights, which are really where much of stewardship is now focused, relates to the way in which investors interact with companies. So the views that investors express to company management are a signal as to what issues investors see as important and as to what they expect of company management. And the converse is perhaps equally important. The issues that investors do not raise with companies, or that they do not challenge company performance on, are often interpreted by company management as meaning investors are simply not interested.
Rory, what's the most exciting thing you're seeing in stewardship?
So the most exciting thing is the way in which stewardship has evolved over the past decade from one-on-one dialogue between investors and companies through to the collaborative engagements, through to the idea that investors have a role to play in systemic stewardship, i.e. addressing the systemic social and environmental challenges that we face today. So let me give you an example. Mining 2030 is an initiative that was catalysed by the Church of England Pensions Board, is now supported by some 60 or 80 institutional investors, and is focusing on what is the role of the mining industry in ensuring that we have the critical minerals we need for the low carbon transition. So these critical minerals come from countries such as DRC, from countries in Latin America, and it's probably fair to say the mining industry has been criticised for the social and environmental impacts associated with mining and the manner in which the revenues from mining activities have or have not accrued to local communities. So Mining 2030 is looking at the mining industry and saying, actually, if critical minerals are to be delivered in a way that is socially and environmentally acceptable, what needs to happen and who needs to do it? What's the role of companies in terms of how they manage their impacts? What's the role of, for example, governments in creating the right context and enabling conditions for companies to deliver on that? What's the role of investors? Does investor short-termism exacerbate the problems and the impacts we've seen? So the Mining 2030 project is an exemplar of where and how I think stewardship is going to evolve over the next decade. Investors are going to say, what are the big global challenges? They are hopefully going to think carefully through how those might be addressed and explicitly think about the role that investors and other actors play in addressing them.
And the particular point of detail we want to discuss today is the Stewardship Code itself. Rory, can you elaborate on the Stewardship Code in a bit more detail?
Yes, so the Stewardship Code was first introduced in 2010 in the wake of the global financial crisis. Its original focus was on corporate governance. Are companies, particularly in the finance sector, appropriately governed and managed and appropriately able to withstand and manage risks? It has evolved over the years. It has, through various revisions, placed greater emphasis on the role of asset owners as the owner of companies. It has placed much greater emphasis on conflicts of interest between the owners of companies and the entities they invest in and others. And has also placed much greater emphasis on moving beyond a rhetorical commitment to stewardship to an actuality of stewardship, i.e., does this stewardship lead to changes in how companies are run? The thing that brought the Stewardship Code very much to the mainstream of investor practice was in 2019 and 2020, when the FRC started scrutinising how signatories were actually implementing the code. In the first iteration in 21, approximately 1/3 of signatories were delisted because their reporting was inadequate. Since then, the way in which investors have approached stewardship and stewardship reporting has improved quite dramatically. We see, I think they're scared of being delisted. They have started to not just present policies, but also talk about how the policies are implemented, i.e. the actions they've taken, and then critically the outcomes that have resulted. So we've seen, I would say, stewardship move from policy statements and sort of nice motherhood and apple pie statements through to action, so dialogue for the sake of dialogue, through now focus on outcomes and impacts, i.e. what is resulting from this engagement or from this dialogue. So I think we've seen the world change. I think the Stewardship Code has been catalytic to that, both by creating expectations and by having what is widely recognised as a credible and robust monitoring and enforcement process.
Would you say the Stewardship Code has delivered in meeting its targets and its objectives? We advise a lot of investors here at Chronos on what good stewardship practice looks like and how stewardship can deliver on their investment and ultimately sustainability goals. So would you say the Stewardship Code has delivered?
Yes. So what has it delivered? One, it has forced investors to be much clearer about what they mean by stewardship. What do they stand for? What are they trying to achieve? What have they done? And what have they actually achieved through that work? It has very clearly put sustainability issues, social and environmental issues on the governance agenda. I mean, those issues 10 years ago were very much the poor relation and were seen as being of kind of tertiary interest to investors. Whereas now, and the code's been very important in that, they are seen as central to the stewardship agenda.
Can you give me an example of stewardship putting environmental and social issues on the agenda?
Well, I think we can see the number of investors engaged or supporting collaborative initiatives such as CA 100 Plus is a really good bellwether of that.
And do you mind explaining what CA 100 Plus is?
Okay, it is an initiative backed by some 500 investors which aims to encourage approximately 150 or 160 of the world's largest greenhouse gas emitting companies to set net zero commitments, to set objectives and targets directed at delivering those commitments, and then to adapt and change their strategies and capex plans to deliver those commitments. So it's a hugely ambitious undertaking, a multi-year initiative. I think much of the reason why we've seen so much investor engagement is not just because of investor concerns about climate change, but also the expectations that investors will engage with companies collectively as well as individually on issues that matter to society and to the economy as a whole.
And just being the devil's advocate for a moment, we can't ignore the grumbles from some investors. People complain about the time it goes into writing stewardship reports, the resources, and just the fact that no one will read them. And not to mention the ESG backlash at the moment. There's a lot of investors who are further questioning the value of writing these reports in light of criticisms of ESG in general. What do you have to say to that?
Well, I think it's time to bust some myths about this because a lot of these critiques are actually quite lazy. So people start complaining about the cost of reporting. Well, actually, when you look at what investors do, the level of allocated resource to reporting is actually quite a minor sum compared to the overall cost of running an investment management business. The second point to respond to is that I think the organisations that complain most about reporting burden are often those who see it as a compliance cost. So they're complaining because they're actually implementing a process that is almost deliberately designed not to create value for them as an organisation. So organisations who support initiatives like the Stewardship Code and welcome reporting are those who see it as providing strategic benefits, as a chance to reflect on their systems and processes, and a chance to make what they do on stewardship better. The third group are, I think a lot of people see stewardship reporting as some kind of end in itself, and then complain when nobody reads the 100-page thumper of report they've produced. But of course, we're not writing a book here. This is an account of what investors do. The value comes from summarising that into a stewardship summary that general readers can use, turning it into blogs and other communications materials, and using the data and evidence to communicate through social media. So I hear a lot of noise about who benefits from the Stewardship Code. And I would say that many organisations benefit from it, but there are those who see it as an opportunity to improve what they do and to support their communications approach as part of an overall communications activity, not just as it's another report we've got to do.
And what would you say to those investors who are complaining about stewardship in light of the ESG backlash?
So I might talk a little bit about how reporting processes drive value for investors. So what we've done with many of the organizations we've done stewardship reports or TCFD or similar reports with is we've asked them to start by describing who they are as an organization and what they exist to do. So generally you will find investors will describe their purpose as being to deliver products for their clients that deliver appropriate risk return profiles, or to provide a long-term safe home for people's savings, or to allow people to save for the future, something like that. Generally, what those centre around is back to the old traditional notions of fiduciary duty. You invest prudently, you deliver the kind of returns people want, or investment objectives people want, and you put the client's needs and interests first. So in that context, the question then is, so how can you do that? Of course, investment markets go up and down and you have a certain amount of risk in your investment style. But actually stewardship is probably the one thing every investor can do to protect and enhance the value of their investments. Why? Because they can ensure the entities they invest in are well governed. They can ensure the entities they invest in are governed in the interests of the saver or the investor. They can ensure the entities properly manage risk. So managing, regulatory compliance and social environmental performance. And they can encourage companies to look at and explore opportunities. So the net zero transition is going to happen. How are you going to benefit from it? What do you do with your product mix in that context? So the ESG backlash, I think, has misrepresented and misframed much of the discussion. The question is, for any investor is, how can we be better at what we do? And how can the companies we invest in be better at what they do so that they are better investments for the long term? The ESG backlash, frankly, is quite irrelevant to that discussion. This is about how you create long-term value for customers and beneficiaries, and the creation of long-term value, I would say almost without exception, is a central goal for virtually every institution I can think of.
So we've talked a lot about institutions, a lot about governance, a lot about the Stewardship Code itself. But I think what most people will be interested in is the actual impacts it's having on the ground. Certainly at Chronos, we're really interested in impact. For example, we worked with one client, Brunel, who have a great example of engaging with Sainsbury's on encouraging them to become a living wage employer. Whilst that's not happened yet, it has resulted in an extra 19,000 people receiving pay rises. Coming back to this idea of impacts on the ground, can you give us your thoughts on whether the activity around the Stewardship Code itself and what investors are forced to do is having those sorts of real-world impacts?
Okay, so I'm going to give two answers. I'm going to talk a little bit about the process and the process benefits of the code, and then I'm going to answer your question, Ash, about what sort of outcomes have been seen. So on the process, the evidence is that the code and the focus by the FRC has led to investors allocating more resource to stewardship. It has enabled investors to better prioritise where they focus their attention, and the addition of environmental and social issues to the range of issues that need to be covered. It has led to investors having more organisational buy-in to the idea of stewardship. Stewardship code submissions have to be reviewed by senior management within the organisation. It has led to greater support for collective initiatives, and has led to greater emphasis or focus on systemic issues, which is an explicit requirement of the code. One of the challenges with all this stewardship stuff is that individual case studies don't really tell us anything, and there are lots of them. Every report is littered with them. Probably the more substantive and interesting body of evidence relates to those collective initiatives which are based on benchmarks. So benchmarks essentially provide an objective measure at the beginning of the program, and then track performance over time. And then at the end of the initiative, some of the years later, you can say, well, how far have we got? What contribution has the initiative made, and has it been worthwhile or not? There is a growing number of examples of initiatives that have been set up with that kind of structured evaluation model, where the evidence is that engagement or stewardship delivers. So probably the headline poster child has been Climate Action 100 Plus, which is backed by some 500 institutional investors, engaging with some 160 of the world's largest emitters. What we've seen since the initiative was established is that majority of those entities have now committed to net zero. Many of them are now setting targets and implementing strategies to deliver on that goal. And some 2/3 of the companies covered by the initiative have improved their emissions intensity over the period that CO100 Plus has been running. So concrete, tangible evidence of change. We have seen similar changes in other initiatives in areas like animal welfare and in relation to mental health, which is a benchmark being run by CCLA. In those cases, what we have seen are companies strengthen their policies, take concrete action on the issues in question, and deliver real outcomes for the animals in the case of animal welfare, or for the individuals and employees in the case of the mental health benchmark over time. So lives improved, yes. Environmental performance improved, yes. Yes, the well-being of people and animals improved, yes. I think the evidence base is there on the collaborative initiatives. And I say the weakness, but I think it's a weakness that the Stewardship Code reporting will help us address, is the effectiveness of individual engagements and how those play through into improved corporate performance. But I think that's simply a gap in the information and evidence rather than any sort of question around the effectiveness of stewardship.
Right. So it's more investors coming together and exerting pressure on companies, as a group, rather than individual investors exerting pressure on individual companies, that is having the most impact.
I think that's right, but for two reasons. One is many of those collective initiatives have been based on an objective framework, whereas individual dialogue isn't necessarily as such. But secondly, I think you're right, Ash, the fact that investors not just come together, but that they have an aligned agenda, it allows companies to understand it's not just a random investor here and a random question there, that there actually is a coherent, consistent set of expectations. And when you're talking about companies and when you're talking about these big strategic issues, making change or making commitments is not trivial. So companies need to be sure and confident that investors agree on what is expected of them and that investors will stick with this agenda over time. And that's actually one of the other important contributions the Stewardship Code has made by requiring organisations to report each year. It requires them to signal not just what they've done, but also their ongoing commitment to some of these longer term stewardship and change initiatives.
Of course, because change doesn't happen overnight.
That is so true. That is very true.
So you touched on this briefly, Rory, and I guess looking forward, as the FRC and the wider industry consider what an updated or an improved stewardship code might look like, what recommendations would you make to the FRC?
So I think there are three. Probably the most important is to keep going. There is a lot of noise around the stewardship code saying, reduce the amount of reporting required or perhaps reduce the frequency of monitoring and review. Actually, the code has been hugely successful, due in no small part to the willingness of the FRC to invest in monitoring and reviewing. So the evidence from similar initiatives is that if the regulator pulls back from monitoring and review, then the organisations will start to drift. The real influence of the Stewardship Code in the FRC has been that the threat or the excitement of monitoring has kept people focused on this area. So the first thing I would say is that the FRC needs to keep going. It needs to both maintain its monitoring, it needs to maintain its willingness to remove people from the list of signatories if they're not performing. But critically, it also needs to encourage and support the leaders. I think nobody wants to be beaten up all the time. And I think when we talk with investors, people welcome the FRC's highlighting of good and best practice. They showcase it to their clients and actually allows for a really healthy dialogue with the regulator. So the first point is the FRC needs to keep going and it deserves huge praise from all of us. But there are, of course, two things that the FRC should do.
Always caveat.
There's always this. So I had three, so I've given my one bit of positive. So there is one structural weakness in the code review process, which is that it emphasises the actions and the outcomes achieved in the reporting year. Now, back to a point you made earlier on in the conversation, Ash, change takes time. Often these changes are multi-year, they're possibly decadal in scale before you see the full changes or outcomes you need. I think the FRC could do a better job of encouraging people to report on what they've done in the reporting year, but to talk about outcomes and impacts over a longer period of time, over the duration of the engagement. And then the third area, which I think is not so much a recommendation to the FRC, we'll make it to the FRC because that's who we're talking to. I hope they're listening, which is that actually there is a lot of reporting at the moment. There's a lot of duplication in reporting requirements. There is not a lot of alignment on detail, and there's not a lot of mutual recognition. I think there's some very practical things that could be done there, as we're seeing in the corporate reporting space with a lot of effort consolidating around ISSB. I think the FRC could play a really useful role in helping just consolidate reporting requirements align them as much as possible and do a lot more on mutual recognition. So if somebody is a signatory to the Stewardship Code in Japan, then that should allow it to meet the requirements of the Stewardship Code in the UK. The idea that you have to do separate reports for different jurisdictions is a bit of a nonsense in today's age. So to summarise, 3 recommendations to the FRC. 1, keep going, you're doing a great job. 2, think about outcomes and impacts as a multi-year test, not just a single year. And 3, see if you can work with others to harmonise, simplify and align reporting obligations.
Definitely. I think that's one of my biggest concerns is around, as all these regulations come out, particularly over the next few years, you've got a number of other regulatory requirements that both companies and investors will be required to comply by. My concern is, will it distract from, the Stewardship Code, or in an effort to bang out all these reports, investors are taking less attention away from Stewardship Code. So I definitely agree with your point and hear you on the harmonisation. I think that would be great going forward. And a slightly different question, what would you say to investors?
Okay, so maybe let me give you a very practical example. So we've worked with Brunel Pension Partnership over a number of years. We worked with them on their climate change policy, which you can imagine was a very technical exercise, quite a lot of reports. We helped them then with their stewardship and responsible investment reporting. But what they did was, so those are all long reports. They're for people like us, people who love reading the detail. But what they then did was they got their communications team to actually use them constructively. So you can see, if you look on the Brunel website, there is all the technical stuff, so all the grounding stuff, and then there are a summary of the policy. There are some very readable blogs about how they developed the policy, and there are blogs then about how they've used all of that work, not just as case studies, but to shape and influence how Brunel functions as a business and Brunel's role in public policy. And you also see how they're using it for employee engagement. So if you look at Brunel's LinkedIn posts and at their website, there's a whole pile of communications which is not directed at the sustainability people, but at other people, explaining why Brunel is such a great organisation, how sustainability is so integral to its purpose. That's a classic case of an organisation that had what I would describe as quite a very technical job to do, develop a policy. It then had a whole pile of work to do on implementing the policy, but it then said, let's not leave it sit there and just be proud of it from a sort of a technical point of view, but let's use it to communicate with our clients and members, with the public and with our employees, and showcase the values that underpin our activities as an organisation.
So if I was to sum up our conversation today, then I think we can say that stewardship is a hugely important part of what investors do. And the Stewardship Code itself and the impact that it's had on mobilising the investment industry cannot be understated. In the investment community itself, stewardship has led to investors building capacity for stewardship resources and more collaboration across the industry on issues such as climate change, mental health, human rights, collaboration which perhaps wouldn't have happened if it wasn't for the Stewardship Code. And turning now to companies, the Stewardship Code has had an instrumental role in driving positive short-term and long-term performance of companies. A message to the FRC is keep going. Be smarter about how resources and reporting are done, reflect on the benefits of long-term engagement, and stay focused on the real-world benefits, because we can't lose sight of the big picture. This is about driving positive impact on society and environment and action on climate change. Thank you. That's all from our first episode of Chronos Talks. How do you think it went?
Pretty good. I thought I was pretty good. How do you think you did?
Yeah, not too bad. Not too bad. There's always areas for improvement.
Of course. Yes, of course.
If you're interested in hearing some more of our candid thoughts about the worlds of sustainable finance and corporate sustainability, please have a look at our LinkedIn, Chronos Sustainability. That's CHRONOS. And yes, if you've got questions, again, reach out to us. But that's all for now. Thank you.
Thank you.